Hey, hello, 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 hello. I have this really pathetic and desperate guy called Marty. You might have heard of him that wants to just sit in the call too. Is that okay? He said he'd talk to you first, so.
There we go. Is it
Oh, hey,
working
I hear
now?
you. Yeah, what's up?
Yeah. I didn't know if it would be okay. Because I know that you weren't sure about Ask Yourself being in and stuff. So yeah, I'm happy with Marty as well because he's probably a bit better of a translator of Hegelian thought than
Yeah,
me.
maybe, yeah. I like ask yourself, you just sometimes the conversations feel like very personal. And
Uh, I don't like Ask Yourself.
yeah, and it's like, I mean, these are all like interesting thoughts to me, but like my ego isn't like hanging on the outcome of any of these conversations, so. Um,
Yeah, I understand. I think me and Ask Yourself kind of had like a bit of a tiff because I don't like name the trade. So he's like, he kind of just anything to get a jab at us. So sometimes.
sure. Okay. All right, what's up? How you doing?
Is Marty there? I can't hear him.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm here.
yeah, he's
Oh,
there.
hey, Marty.
Yeah, I'll just be kind of in the background helping you when you need help.
That would be genuinely useful, mate. Absolutely.
As a completely neutral partisan to this dialogue, I'll also help Destiny clarify on his questions, though, to be fair.
Thank you. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna need more help here than the other guys. So.
Are you already live, or is it? Are
Yep.
you
Oh
just
yeah,
doing
I'm live
that
and
now?
everything.
Oh,
Yeah.
hello everyone who I didn't know was there. Nice to meet you.
All
Oh,
right. So you wanna? What are we talking about today?
yeah. So I mean, hopefully, I just want to kind of open up the dialogue, mostly about like ethical realism. Whether there is a right and a wrong that we should abide by in our
Mm-hmm.
day-to-day lives, and what that would actually like be grounded upon. Metaethics, in other words. I suppose the only other thing that I would like to talk about, although I don't know if you'd want to talk about it, would be like whether we are obligated to be vegan. But I think that would be the conclusions that I would draw from my position of realism.
Um.
That's obviously it's up to you because I know that you're not speaking to vegans really at the minute, are you? So
Yeah. I mean, I imagine if we have a conversation that, I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and assume that if you're vegan, that it's coming from your moral obligations, and that's almost gonna necessarily follow, right? If you feel like you have a solid foundation established, that would be my assumption, right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess my point, like the reason I end up in like I'm writing my PhD on whether we should or should not be vegan. Like writing a dialectical defense,
Mm-hmm.
like a Hegelian defense of veganism, and essentially what I'm trying to argue is that the foundations of which we use for ethics, which I would argue are an equality between individuals, is applicable to animals as well. And well, actually, not only applicable, but already entails animals. And that way, when we apply, that's why like Jeremy Bentham, what he was really showing when he was saying that our reasons and our justifications for prejudices when applied to humans, they're clearly inadequate to show like that we can treat someone different from another. So like skin color or whatever it may be is not an adequate justification for treating someone different. And the foundations for those, the foundation for our ethical treatment typically is suffering,
Mm-hmm.
which we see in animals. And then I would say that's essentially where I would like essentially go with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let's start with okay, I guess. Do you want to start with the morality, or do you want me to just ask my question and we can kind of go from there? I guess.
It's up to you.
Uh huh.
I would love to know, I guess, what like understand your kind of meta ethic first, so that I kind of understand like the position you're coming from. Obviously, I think you kind of got mine that I'm going to say there is a right and a wrong, and it
Yeah, of
involves the
course.
expression of
Sure. So so here, get ready to get triggered. So my position is fuck meta ethics. Okay. I feel like I feel like any meta ethical claims are completely and totally unverifiable. I feel like any
Right.
meta ethical claims are immaterial. I don't even feel like I can have a meaningful conversation about meta ethics. And then similar to the morality discussion we'll get into later, my problem with meta ethics is I feel like two people that are using like rationally consistent systems are never going to be able to resolve a dispute between the two of them for who's making like better meta ethical claims. That's essentially like
Right.
my position. Yeah. So
Surely,
like,
like,
or go ahead.
I was just going to say, even to say that the normative system was like, let's say the normative system is rational and consistent.
Mm-hmm.
My point would be like, let's say they're using a word like good. That would be a meta-ethical question of as to what that actually means, even for their system, would it not?
if they say, wait, or repeat that last part again.
So let's say they assume that, let's say, like, they're a utilitarian and they think that, you know, the minimization of suffering is the greatest and overall, like, goal of their system. Like, they would have to have like, that would be a meta-ethical claim entailed in the normative system. And
Yeah,
so like, what is good and bad? And
yeah, my understanding is you can't have normative ethics without some kind of meta-ethical claim, right?
Yeah,
Utilitarianism makes sense unless it's with respect to somebody. Yeah, so I have this vague notion of, like, every human being seems to have some shared set of preferences, and then that's kind of like what I would seek to maximize through any normative ethical system. So, like, most people like to be healthy, you know, relatively. Most people like to have clothes, food, shelter, stuff like that. And then, so, like, these are the things that through my normative system, I would try to maximize among all people, essentially.
Right. And I guess the position I would say is that I think that metaethics is normally entailed by, like, a contradiction in a normative ethical system. So I think when you're going through your metaethical your normative ethical system, you'll come to a point where you're like, okay, this is not working. Like, to get the cogs on turning, something's messing up here.
Yep.
And then you're brought back into metaethics to analyze your normative ethical system as something might be going wrong. And I think that's normally why we end up there. But, you know, I'm just a glutton for punishment, and I just spend all my time there. So, I guess the point I'm trying to understand.
What you just said, just as a quick thing, and maybe this get brought up later, is one of the reasons why I feel like metaethics is bullshit. It makes it. I'm using strong words. I don't mean it, but, like, so it feels to me like ethics are all of ethics are, like, post hoc rationalized based on the feelings of the subject. So, like, let's say, for instance, let's say that you had, like, a school of the most loyal Kantian philosophers in the world. They've studied German so they can read the original text, and all of his stuff is perfectly 100% rationally consistent. Let's say that, like, the lost chapters of Kant were uncovered in some tomb somewhere. And let's say that within these texts, Kant lays out a 100% perfectly morally consistent obligation to, like, rape children. Some crazy out of the thing like that, right? I think that instead of most people saying, like, oh, okay, well, yes, like, logic and reason, you know, compels us to these positions, I think they would reject it outright based on their own feelings and say, well, nope, time to leave Kant. We're going to find something else. And then they would go and find some other meta-ethical theory or whatever. But then at the end of the day, all of it is, like, this post hoc justification based on the feelings of the subject. That's what it feels like to me.
I mean, I would absolutely disagree, but I think that when, let's say you were to, like, you know, analyze, let's say, like, whether it was 100% justified to, you know, hurt children. I think the issue I think I'd have is that, like, one, I mean, intuitively, I'd like to think that there isn't a 100% rational way to rape children. But and moreover, I think that if the argument was that compelling, you could not help but be convinced, as in, like, if let's say the position was instead something a little bit more intuitively comprehensible. So, you know, it is okay to commit an act of harm against a child if we're in a scenario in which that harm would ultimately mitigate the harm against others. Or you know, it would be better to have that harm done to somebody else's child than your own child because you have a greater moral obligation, whatever Kantian kind of, you know, sidestepping it kind of does.
Sure.
Then the reason in itself would have an impact upon you, because I would say that it is the reasoning that ultimately it is reason itself that ultimately modifies your expression of first order desire, because you don't act on every single desire you have. You sit back, you think about it, and you think about, oh wait, is this urge, is this impulse or compulsion, whatever action, urge and process, you know, the one that I wish to, you know, go down. And you normally have a few desires that you veto and you go, no, that's not justifiable, and you have ones that you do act upon. And there's times when, for example, you know, like, someone's a absolute arse in me local little, and I very well might want to hit them, but I don't hit them because obviously I don't think it's the right thing to do. But I don't take that on a post hoc, I didn't want to hit them. I did want to hit them. I vetoed that desire. And I would say that desire was in relation to all my other desires. And this is what Hegel calls the system of drives. So the system of drives would be, like, all of our first order desires. And then what reason would be, or reasoning would allow us to create second order desires.